Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Reverend Amantha Barbee, and I am standing in for Erin Barbee tonight in our Charlotte Pride's Interfaith Program discussion. We've invited members of the community to join us for the third of a four-part conversation series exploring issues of racism and religion in our local community. Faith institutions, in particular, churches in the Christian faith tradition have long been at the center of movements for civil rights and racial reconciliation, as well as our Jewish brothers and sisters and siblings. But churches and people of faith have also been the perpetrators of racism and white supremacy. As we celebrate the continued growth of LGBTQ affirming spaces in our faith communities, what are we doing to address lingering issues of racism present in these very same institutions? Tonight we have joining us Reverend John Cleghorn, Reverend Clifford Matthews, Reverend Debra Hopkins, Bishop Tonyia Rawls, and Rabbi Asher Knight, and they will come to you in their own way in just a few minutes. But each of our conversations is built upon one upon the other, seeking to challenge the thinking about the role of our faith communities in this work. In previous conversations, we've tackled race and religion and what racial reconciliation may look like and what is the religious role in that. Our goal tonight, community members and congregations alike, look to our faith-based communities for guidance during tumultuous times, and we are certainly experiencing tumultuous times right now. At times, faith-based communities are either all talk and no action, as we are often accused, or quiet until others lead. We want to explore how to respond to racism and discrimination, and how COVID-19 has played a part in this. So as a way of introduction, I'd like to go around the room and allow my friends, whom I've not seen in some time, to just tell us a bit about you, where you work, where you serve, a little bit about your passion around our subject tonight, and greet the people in your own way. Let's see, I'll go in my order of screen. So let's start with John Cleghorn.
Hi, good evening. Amantha, what a pleasure and a privilege to be with you, so to speak, digitally, and to share this time and space with you. Welcome back to Charlotte, and I know you're doing great things in Atlanta. I was just through there, and if I'd had an extra 5 minutes, I would have found you and looked you up. I have been on 2 or 3 of these, and this has been a wonderful conversation. So I'll be quick. I'm John Cleghorn. I'm the pastor of Caldwell Presbyterian Church. That's about 1.5 miles outside the center city in the Elizabeth neighborhood. I have the blessing of leading that congregation along with Gail Henderson Belcito. And it's a diverse congregation that is deeply passionate about issues of justice and diversity and building the beloved community. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Good to see you too, John. I did not tell you where I serve. I am the pastor at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church in Decatur, Georgia, which actually looks a lot like John Cleghorn's church in Charlotte. So we have that in common. And let's move to Bishop Tonyia Rawls.
Hi, everybody. Good evening on this eve of the week. I am so excited to be here. I'm Bishop Tonyia Rawls. I am pastor of Sacred Souls United Church of Christ, located in East Charlotte, and also founder and executive director of the Freedom Center for Social Justice. I am an out Black lesbian woman, and as such, This conversation is vitally important to me. It's important to me in my own personage, but it's also important to me as a mother of sons, as a grandmother, and now great-grandmother. This is a personal topic. And, there are some topics where we kind of talk about them and they're like kind of out here. But when we think about the things we're facing in America today, this is personal. And I am grateful for the opportunity that I have, along with my other siblings here, for us to grapple in ways that hopefully will make the world a better place for us, yes, but more importantly, for the generations to come. So excited to be on this walk with each of you.
Thank you. Thank you. And let's move to Reverend Cliff Matthews.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Cliff Matthews, pastor of St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church. I've been there now since 2000, so about 20 years. A year ago, I started in the path of social work, and so I'm also a licensed clinical social worker associate. I have that license, and I'm working currently within the Mecklenburg County Jail as a clinician, working with individuals who have special needs or severe and persistent mental illness. And I am thankful to be here tonight and thankful for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Reverend Debra Hopkins.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, my sister. I have not seen you in about a couple of years. It is a pleasure to see you, and you're looking well, and we will catch up soon. I'm Reverend Debra Hopkins. I'm the founding pastor of Essentials for Life Ministries, which is a online ministry here in Charlotte, North Carolina, but I'm also the founding director, executive director of There's Still Hope, a nonprofit organization that provides now transitional shelter for our transgender adults who find themselves homeless here in Charlotte. And this is my second stint on this broadcast, and I'm delighted to be here to continue this discussion around the subject of racism. This subject has been in place for such a long time, and I'm just hoping that tonight we will continue the conversation to find answers and point in a direction that will motivate many of us to want to be a part of change. We're praying, I'm sure the entire panel tonight is praying earnestly, continuing to petition to those in our community who have not gone out and voted to please make sure Tuesday they get out and exercise their constitutional right. So I'm looking forward to sharing with my colleagues and hearing and learning and listening to our audience sharing their thoughts and opinions as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Rabbi Asher Knight, welcome.
Thank you so much, Reverend Barbee. It is really good to see you. I've missed seeing you in Charlotte, and so it's wonderful to be here with my clergy colleagues and friends here in Charlotte. I'm Rabbi Asher Knight. My pronouns are he, him. I was looking at figuring out how to add it back, how to add it in, and I couldn't figure it out, so I apologize about that. I am the senior rabbi of Temple Bethel here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And why this is an important conversation for me? Well, first off, it's important because in the Jewish tradition, we often talk about an Exodus narrative, recognizing the world as it is and the world as we want it to be. And I think anyone who's looking at the world as it is right now cannot possibly say that the world as it is the world that we want it to be. And we have a lot of work to do to walk from here to there and to get towards a promise and potential of the future. It's also about because I have my own children and what kind of life and communities and society I want to see them have them inherit. And it is also because I'm the child of a gay man. In my own personal life have experienced anti-Semitism, and our community has experienced anti-Semitism and forms of racism. And it's important to my community. There are people of color in the Jewish community, lots of them. And it's very, very important to me that we have a society that represents the best values possible. So as a rabbi, as a father, as a husband, and as a community leader, this conversation is very important to me.
Thank you to everyone. In our opening sentences, we made some claims that the faith-based community has been in some way silent in this work. But I also heard in your introductions that it's personal to each and every one of you. And I know for a fact that the people on this panel have not been silent in ways in work of racism. But we have often complained that there are not enough of us out there. But as we look forth to erasing racism and what our response is, we're guided by the need of partners in this work. So I just want to jump right in. We've got some incredible panelists tonight, and just start with one or two words that describe the current state of racism in Charlotte. Now, full disclosure, I was born and raised in Charlotte. I've seen a lot of changes in Charlotte. So I'm very interested to know what your response, your one or two word response would be as we frame our conversation tonight. We'll go in reverse order. Rabbi.
Oh boy. I think Charlotte is far more segregated than people would like to admit. And so that, if you're talking about one word at least, it is that we have it has been hard to build power centers across lines of difference because of the type of segregation we have in our city. And I think that that segregation also includes a socioeconomic, clearly also massive socioeconomic differences that we are knowledgeable of, but seem to not often gain the emphasis and effort to really confront head on. And I think those are two of the major issues I feel like I'm seeing in Charlotte, let alone others as well. But I'll stick at those two right now.
Thank you. Reverend Debra.
One or two words. Oh my goodness. I've been here 10 years. And what I continue to see is division. If I'm looking for a word, one or two words, division is still ever present in the various circles that I see across the city and within the state itself, which is quite troubling still to me. I'm optimistic, which would be my second word, but yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you. Reverend Cliff.
So you said one word to describe the current state of racism in Charlotte. I would say Charlotte/Mecklenburg County. Is that correct?
Yes, one or two words or a sentence that describes the current state.
One word would be still, S-T-I-L-L.
Say just a bit more about that.
That the racism that was present in the foundation of those nice neighborhoods such as Dilworth and Myers Park, the development of that wonderful community called Ballantyne, the deed, the covenant restrictions and all of that we talk about so much, that was a symbol of racism in the founding or in the growth of this community. That racism is still present. And I think that's where there needs to be greater conversation on the fact that after all of the conversation, especially civil rights era to now, that racism seems to be that thing which is altogether, I would say, wiser than our own strategies, because apparently, after all these years and all this effort, racism still exists in this community, in this city, in this state, in this world, in this country. So still.
Bishop Tonyia.
I have 3 words. The first word is fatigue. There is a fatigue that happens with chronic ills, whether it is in the body, physically, or in the body popular as it relates to community. The second word that comes to mind is grapple. The one thing I have to say is, and it's not all of Charlotte, but segments of Charlotte are grappling with this issue. You know, it's one of those things where we have to appreciate the fact that the grappling is happening while the grappling is also fatiguing, right? And then the last word for me is hope, hopeful. I do feel hope, and I feel hope because what this process of eradicating or responding to racism reminds me of is an old song that the church would sing, talking about each round goes higher and higher. So it feels like we're dealing with the same exact thing at the same exact point, but actually that's not true. We're actually dealing with the same exact thing, this chronic issue of racism in America, but we actually are dealing with it at a different level. And it is that level that gives me hope, in the sense that when I said the thing about, you know, I'm doing this, yes, as a cleric, as an activist, all of those things, but also I'm doing it personally because I want to leave the world a better place before I go. Understanding that someone else then has to pick up from where I left off, because we're picking up where somebody else left off. And so I think it's really vital that we keep that before us, because in the absence of that, one might lose hope. So those are my words: fatigue, grapple, and hope.
Thank you. And Reverend John.
Well, those are great words. Thank you all. The one word that immediately comes to mind for me is tenuous. Tenuous. That is to say that I completely identify with Cliff's word still, because at times it seems as if we're not making any progress at all. I also identify with where the bishop is coming from and claiming hope, even if there's not lots and lots of progress. So I would say it's in a fragile, tenuous state. We have not made nearly the progress that we need to have made, especially when we realize the Chetty study that, of course, found Charlotte was 50th out of 50 is still hung around our neck. And I don't know that we've done a whole lot in response to that. Police shootings, other signs that we still got significant problems. Racism is deeply embedded into America and in Charlotte. And so I would say it's tenuous, but perhaps I like every rung goes higher and higher. We are climbing Jacob's ladder.
Thank you. These words are powerful, and it just leads me, as I do know the work that you all have done and continue to do. Why do we think that it's not happening more in faith-based communities? This has been an ongoing argument for years now. Where is the religious community in this work? And I will put on the back end of that, why are we not more present? Cliff, let's go to you.
Well, that's where is the faith community in this?
Yes.
Is that the question? Well, why do we not see more churches involved? I thought about this somewhat today in preparation for this And Bishop Rawls, I just thank God for you because you are such the optimist. And, I just love that about you because you always you have this eschatological frame from which you work. And I think it's awesome. However, I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as maybe I used to be. I think the struggle that the church is having when it deals with racism is that it cannot look at racism and not look in the mirror and recognize the role it has played in the subjugation of people, the oppressing of individuals who fall outside of what they would consider normal, the role the church has played in really continuing the narrative of trauma inflicted upon persons of the LGBTQ community. I think the reality is for the church to really wrestle or grapple or deal with racism, it has to also recognize, especially, and I say this because, and I don't want to make it, especially the white church is built upon the foundation of oppression, subjugation, racism. We are in this country because folk came to this country and displaced First Nations persons and built this country through slave labor that denied personhood to individuals. And as early as the 1600s, made it part of law in Virginia and South Carolina, So, and then the wealth that belongs to the white church is often wealth that was built through oppressive, destructive ways. So I think when the church, and I'm gonna say this, the white church looks at racism and wonders why, the question is, why aren't we more involved? There's an easier narrative, and the easier narrative is to say, well, that's the past. And since civil rights era, we've given, folk the right to vote, and we've given housing reforms, and you just go out now and do the best you can, what you got, without any recognition of the legacy of trauma that was done to persons who look like persons who are not within their frame of normal. So I think to look at racism is really to say, almost like a person will have to say, how can I say this? I want to change my entire DNA structure so I can be a new thing. And I don't know if that is possible. So I don't know.
Okay. So Rabbi Asher, you come into this conversation with a little bit different lens.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I can't really speak about the church. I have a hard time speaking about the church as I don't know the experience of the church and the building of it.
I honor your temple. Speak.
Yeah. Temple. Thank you. So I think there's a variety of reasons why the faith communities haven't been as good about being out there. One is that, I'm going to say something that's going to sound perhaps not deflective. I don't mean to sound deflective, but so if it sounds that way, please you can tell me that it sounds that way. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a old Wile E. Coyote cartoon. I don't know if you ever remember the Wile E. Coyote cartoon. And he builds a bicycle with wings attached to go catch the Roadrunner. And after he goes off the mesa, he realizes that no matter how hard he's cycling, he's not flying, and he starts to fall. And the challenge, part of the challenge of being Wile E. Coyote on the bicycle is that when you're on a bicycle with wings attached and you're noticing that it's not flying, your only thought to respond to the situation is to pedal harder, right? And the challenge is that we all know that no matter how hard you pedal, it's actually not designed to fly. All right. So bear with me for a second. Okay. And what I mean to say about that is that I actually think that there are a lot of faith institutions and a lot of clergy who are pedaling really hard right now. I hope that you understand where I'm coming from. They're pedaling really hard, and their churches and faith institutions are having challenges. Their people are, have a variety of dynamics that are facing them, and it is really, really hard to look when you're pedaling so hard, and to look and to actually recognize that the structure, the system that you're on is in fact not designed to fly the way that you want it to, right? You're so stuck pedaling, you're not moving and you're not flying up. So it's maybe a tenuous metaphor, but what I mean to say that is I actually think faith institutions are having a challenge because there's actually real challenges within faith institutions that aren't just about race, but are actually about the dynamics of financial sustainability, about being able to be supportive of their members, of the minimal staff and maximal hours working, right? Like there's all these different dynamics that I think are really putting pressure onto faith institutions. Number one. Number two, I also think that when you look at it, it has been, and one of the words that I use, I think I really appreciated every word that that Bishop Rawls said and Cliff said and Debra said. One of the challenges that has been is that when you are stuck in this space where you're working, you're pedaling. It is really hard to look up and also build relationships across lines of difference in our city. It is really hard. And if I want to go do that from South Charlotte, I've got to drive, 30 to 40, sometimes 45 minutes, no matter what, right? And so our relationships, the tenuousness that I think Reverend Cleghorn talked about, the tenuousness of what's happening in Charlotte is also because we don't, as clergy, have deep relationships, the kind of relationships that we need to have to build power across lines of difference. And when you don't have those relationships, I don't think you show up, right? If that makes sense. Like, I think that when you're missing the relationships, like if I know that something is impacting, Bishop Rawls because I know her, right? And I know we have a relationship and she calls me up and says, Asher, I need you here. Or I see something happen. I call her up and I say, I will be there. Like, because we don't have those relationships, we're not showing up for each other and we're not encouraging our communities to do so either. So I know that those are maybe two things, but those are things that I feel like I'm seeing. And the result of that also is that when certain things flare within our city, as Reverend Cleghorn was talking about, I have found that it's really interesting that very often the clergy that gather to meet, some of whom have never even met each other before. I don't know if Reverend Cleghorn, if you can talk about that too, but some of us have been at the table, and some of us come, and some of us will go to the protests, but some of us have just never actually met, and that is a really challenging aspect. And I think that if you're going to stand up and push to make this happen, you also don't want to do it alone. And I think that the church and the members of our faith institutions also need to be building relationships, and so that they're not doing it alone either. And I think that's part of the challenge. So I'll be quiet.
So I'm going to ask now that Reverend John and Bishop Tonyia have a conversation about this answer, because I'm seeing heads nod in different ways. We've learned a little bit about each of them tonight, and then I'm going to ask Debra to close us on this subject. But I would like to hear a conversation between Bishop and Reverend John about this topic.
Well, that's a great pairing because John and I have been working together for more than 20 years now. Like Reverend Matthews, I've been here for 20 years as well, 21 years this year. And John, one of the things that I've noticed over the years, our work first started actually around health with HIV and AIDS, and this chronic disease that was impacting definitely the gay community, but in particular, Black folk were getting sick at proportionately higher levels. And we were trying to grapple again with that subject. One of the things, referencing Reverend Matthews' piece about my hope, is I'm also a student of history. And one of the things about history is it has a way of informing as it relates to what's to come, but also we can glean from it, right? So the thing that's important to keep in mind for me is America is still an experiment. She's young. As it relates to world civilizations, America is a baby. And we don't always embrace that fully, what that means. Democracy is an experiment, the way that we do democracy in America. And so if that is then true, is it not then, when we think about how few the years are since Black folk have been freed, relatively speaking, right? That's a short period of time. Like, people are just dying off who can remember Jim Crow, okay? So there are people alive who lived through the post-slavery era, all right? And so when we keep that all in perspective, then it helps for me to see, oh my goodness, well, I have an opportunity, number one, to bring a new, unique voice into the public square, whereas before that square, the discourse was always dominated by white men, and typically older white men. And now those voices are becoming more diverse. But beyond that, I also have agency. And that's something important to own. I do have a sense of agency now. I have agency at the local level. I'm a pastor. I have agency statewide. I'm a board member of the state NAACP. I have agency nationally with many of the organizations I work with across the country, and I have international agency. So if I say that about just myself, this Black preacher down in Charlotte, North Carolina, saying that agency, if I own that agency, and then that agency joins with others, then what I'm able, John, to do is to own the fact that if I don't like this world, I get to create a new one. I do. I get to create a new one. And is that not what God has said to us? I have given you power. And what did we get the power for? We got the power to create. And what do we get to create? We get to create a world that is more just, a world that is, we can live in abundance. And so that is what keeps me encouraged. And what I believe is this COVID experience has actually propelled us closer to how we are actually supposed to live as the church. For what it did was it decentralized the church. So now the 11 o'clock hour is no longer the most segregated hour in America. Why? Because like the six of us are here on this call, we're all now having to do these same things, but from our own sites. And does that not possibly open up an opportunity that did not exist when we were so anchored to the brick and mortar to actually create a much more fluid experience, and one where actually more voices get included in the conversation? So as if we could have been together physically, we would have hosted this at somebody's church or at Temple Beth El or one of those other locations. Now that we're hosting it this way, right, we have an opportunity for literally tens of thousands of people to join with us on this conversation. So I say this to just say this round actually is higher. And if we can be courageous enough to say, we might just have to throw some of this stuff away that we have considered the church and embrace some new things, but she still is needed. And not just the church, but our communities of faith are still needed. We just have to figure how we get out of the way and allow love to do its thing.
That's some good stuff, Bishop. Thank you. You know, a minute ago, Cliff said that you're always one to bring optimism to the picture, because what I heard from Cliff and the rabbi was clear, somber, and sober thinking about the challenges of the church. Mm-hmm. What I love about your approach is hope. You are talking about hope, hope eternal, hope that is, as Cliff said, eschatological, and you're living in the both and of our opportunity. So that's my favorite lens through which to see the world these days, of both and. we live in the already and the not yet, Bishop.
Yeah.
We are early in this experiment, and we've all heard the metaphor about time that the last 1,000 years is like the thumb, like our fingernail at the end of our arm, which is the span of time. And yet, I think we're all here tonight because we have an urgency about this. Agency, yes, and an urgency. And so we all live in the both and of doing the work, feeling urgent about it, getting tired, like Asher and Cliff talked about, and yet getting up in the morning and continuing to do the work in hope, in that eschatological hope that God has this, and God has Tuesday, and God has a year from Tuesday, and we do our best to show up. So I really identify with what everybody has said. As far as the fundamental question of why the church isn't doing more of this, you all have already touched on so many of the reasons. The church is segregated because our communities are segregated and separated. And there are also so many churches that want to preach the prosperity gospel or the conflict-free gospel, or other churches that don't want to take risk and do everything they can to avoid conflict because it might just cost them a large pledge. So there are so many reasons to Amantha's original question. But Bishop, I'm going to hold on to your perspective and your hope.
If I could just say one quick thing too with that.
Yeah.
There is a study that was done that talked about what is one of the faster ways to affect change within institutions, right? It's not an old school thought, but it's relatively newer. And what it found was that actually, if you really want to move something forward aggressively, right? And, most of the work that I do, especially with the Freedom Center, is about culture shifts, right? So, and culture is one of the very difficult thing because it's so fundamental, right? How do you shift it? And what they found was the old way was we look at what the problem is and we spend a lot of time working on the problem, right? So you spend your time dissecting the problem. What they found, however, was you don't ignore the problem, but when you actually set a path for reimagining what might be possible, you actually not only get more buy-in from people, but they're also more willing to grapple with the core issues that got in the way of you doing whatever this thing is that everybody considers better. And I've been practicing this, and it really does prove to be true. I'm not talking about putting your head in the sand. Anybody that knows me knows I'm not afraid of a fight. But what I am saying is I'm not interested in the heavier pedaling that Rabbi Asher talked about. I'm interested in how do I turn the gear up so that with each pedal that I do, it's advancing us forward. Because in the absence of that, the fatigue sets in. And I think for many of us as faith leaders, we can become so fatigued and jaded that it is very difficult to sit on the wall, as we are called, and to look out and to see the possible that we might be able to guide our people toward that better place, right? And so I just want to put that out there, that sometime it is okay for us to do that leap, making sure that we're okay saying, I might have to actually get rid of a whole part of this base. Maybe we don't do church in buildings no more. Maybe we don't, may have to go for it, right? And address these issues that are so core to American culture. We will not get rid of racism. Cliff, I agree with you, because it's in the fabric, it's woven in the fabric, right? So in that reality, what else can we create? I'm interested in that reimagining. Thank you.
So, because I've had this discussion with Reverend Debra in the past, Reverend Debra had some very pointed opinions and ideas of why or where our faith-based communities are in this fight. So I'm going to ask her to share some of those with us now.
I'm going to take you on another path. because the question is why. And as I look at this panel, this distinguished group in front of me, I'm looking at an older generation. And we're living in a different generation in the way they see things and the way they go about doing things, even within the church. Bishop had made mention of the word fatigue. And I think that many of our faith institutions are tired. And subsequently, they are seeing themselves on that Wile E. Coyote bicycle with wings, pedaling, and not really getting anywhere. And so because of the strenuous challenges that it takes out of all of us, I think that many of our faith institutions have sort of stepped back and just stayed central in the work that they feel that they've been called to do, and that it is what's theirs to do, and leave the more challenging or the more complex issue of racism, which has been in place for such a long time, to those few that are still out there trying to make a difference. This question and this subject is a hard put your finger on to address. It troubles me, yes, because I do believe that the church, out of any of the institutions within the government structure, need to be at the forefront. We need to continue to be leaders in this space of change and what that change looks like, even in the way of tearing down what we used to do, as Bishop made mention of, and trying to recreate anew. And so is it okay for us to be at rallies? Should we show up at rallies? Should we be more vocal in our congregational spaces? These are difficult questions to really put a finger on. But I do think that it's fatigue that's involved in this. I also feel that we've moved from a different generation that has a different perspective on how to combat this issue of racism. And as many of us are still searching for answers, they too are trying to search for answers as well.
And Reverend Cliff, I think you had something to add to. No?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say before we left this conversation today, it'd be a good opportunity maybe to talk about the reality. Let me just wait and maybe we'll get back to it. But there are some parallels in history to where we are. And one of the historical parallels is the era of the radical Reconstruction and how that era brought to the African-American community folk like Booker T. Washington. And as I mentioned in the sermon recently, also W.E.B. Du Bois. That era does give us the lens into perhaps where we're going. And I do think the thing that I'm trying to wrestle with when it comes to this issue, I do think Bishop Rawls is spot on that this is a democracy, it is a young democracy. And what does that mean? And I'm having my own existential crisis as somebody who was a veteran, who was raised to love this country. I mean, when you start talking about patriotism and the songs of our nation, I tear up still, right? This is my country, But the reality is that this country was never founded on the principle of everybody having a voice. And its structures were designed to make sure that basically initially white land-owning men were the only ones who had a voice. Everybody else got a voice through a process of protest, except poor white individuals, white males, who landowning wealthier white men understood in order to keep them down and to use them as our ally in oppression, we had to give them the right to vote. What I'm saying is, this country was never founded to really be a place of racial harmony, as much as it was a place with an ideal that Bishop Rawls talked about, this democracy that is there. But I struggle because I am not so concerned about perhaps the 51% of people who are looking at Mr. Biden for president, but I am wondering what in the world the 45%, the 46%, and I think the Reconstruction era may give us some insight into the real fear of white America concerning their place in this country and their future of their families, that really we need to hear, even if it is a bunch of bullcrap, we need to hear, because I think there's so much fear that somehow Black progress, LGBTQ progress, immigrant progress is somehow a threat to their existential reality, and is not. But that is how this country was started. And I swear I'm not going to say anything else the rest of this time. I'm going to silence, I'm going to mute myself. Peace out.
God has called you to speak truth.
Let me pick up on this a second. Let me pick up on this, because you're absolutely right, Pastor. You know, it's interesting. I'm going to bring it into the state. In 1898, we had the uprising in Wilmington. And what was so profound about it was exactly what Pastor Clifford is speaking on right now, because it is that moment in time where that fear came to the height of stripping, because this was really right after Reconstruction. This was right after Blacks were really rising to prominence. They were in positions of leadership, making decisions, et cetera, and the white establishment at that time was quite fearful of this. And that continues. This is where the origins of Jim Crow came into being. This is the origins of where we are today. And it's frightening for a Black trans woman when walking down the street, no matter where I'm at, in terms of that 45% or that 48% or whatever number that's currently out there surrounding me, and what's going through their mind. What's going through their mind, what they might be willing to do or not do. These are things that frighten me, but yet just my presence frightens them. Just my words of authority and decision making frightens them, and they're doing everything in their power to try to suppress us in ways that will continue to keep us bound. And so we can talk on this subject all night. I'm gonna back off.
Well, we talked about, Bishop talked about possibilities. And I think everyone on this call tonight, and probably everyone who has tuned in, pretty much knows what the problem is. But that ability or inability to turn the corner and to do what is necessary to change is based in nothing but fear. We've named it already. So my question then, if we're going to stand against racism, which is what we have all been called to do as people of faith, to stand against racism, how do we deal with that fear or that anxiety and that knowledge of this is not about a person losing, But it is from the foundation of all of our faith that we are created equal. And we are all children of the Creator. How do we deal with our congregations, to our families? How do we deal with that fear? Bishop?
My sermon today came from the book of Ezra, and it was dealing with the question that was posed to Zerubbabel when he was asked by his enemies, can't we help you build the temple? We want to come and help you build. And Zerubbabel said, our God and King, God and the King, Cyrus, gave us the orders to build or to rebuild, and we're going to rebuild this ourselves. And my topic was, you don't get to turn away from this assignment, okay? And there are times, I believe, that, so I'm just going to just say it specifically. I think Black people have to come together with Black people to determine what it is that we can imagine for ourselves in a nation that never intended for us to win. To imagine among ourselves. There's times when you actually do have to pull back in to your people. And if we're talking about racism, what we're typically talking about when we say racism, we're talking about Black folk, all right? That's the typical discussion around race. And I want to just call it, I want to say Black people, okay? Because there's other variations of it that shows up, but it's still driven by color. It's still driven by skin color. It's about the difference between how Mexicans are treated versus how somebody from Spain is treated. We both speak in Spanish. The distinction for many of us is our skin tone, okay, and hair texture. So we know that it is rooted in the African experience in the Americas. I think that American Black folk and joining in with Black people from other parts of the diaspora must come together and define our own destiny moving forward. Now that's going to scare a lot of people. Why? Because what I said earlier, and that is a lot of us have agency now. We're not starting out as sharecroppers. We're not starting out, and this is to that point again of every round going higher and higher. We're not starting out with empty bank accounts. I'm not walking around with no shoes and a sack on my back. I got a degree. You know what I'm saying? I have a postgraduate experience. I've got a church. I'm a pastor. I'm a wife. And so there is that agency that now, even more so than Black Wall Street, because guess what? We don't need a Black Wall Street. Why? Because we got Black folk on Wall Street playing big time. All right. What would happen if that all pulled together and we decided for once to shape and frame what's best for us? I think that is a beginning. It is not going to come through the master's tools. The same tools that built this house of racism and misogyny, that house cannot be reconstructed with those same tools. We have to bring the new tools, right? But that's the reimagining that I'm talking about. And again, since America is so young, she's still malleable, right? We're not talking about ancient Egypt, for God's sake, okay? We're hundreds of years old, not thousands of years old. So when we think about that and put that in perspective, a lot is possible. Race-specific things for our people are what I'm really vested in right now.
Anybody else?
What I love about that answer is I think the bishop takes full stock of her context and her experience and her voice and is leaning fully into it. And that's different 6 ways around this table. And so the question you're asking, Amantha, is a collective question, but it's also a question for each of us as individuals. And so to do what the bishop has just talked about, each of us has the opportunity to look at who we are, what our voice is, what our perspective is, what our context is, and carry the message out into that. And so my seat is quite different in that, as I thought about this panel, I think one of the, regardless of what happens Tuesday, I need to continue to talk to white folks about the truth and the fallacy of racism, that race is a social construct, and find ways to continue to get that across. And because I think there are waves of folks, and we've seen remarkable progress with a relatively small amount of the population, quite frankly, in this awakening, this reckoning that we've had in the last 6 to 8 months. We have to keep that up and keep pushing closer and closer to that Trump base. We're not going to reach everybody, but I think that, if we each ask ourselves, for people who look like me, it's whites talking to whites about the truth of racism, and doing so boldly and unabashedly, but not just talking about it. Finding that agency and the outlets to change it however we can. So, for me, I look like power and privilege in America, and I've got to figure out a way to use that urgently as agency.
Can I say something? I've listened to both you and Bishop John, and Tuesday, for Black America, if it goes like it did in 2016, how do we, on Wednesday, or whenever we get that announcement, how do we build that community for conversation when what is ever present is that fear of, oh, here we go again? And we've worked hard this year to try to get the vote out, and Tuesday is a very significant date in our history. And if it goes in the wrong direction, how do we, I guess my question would be, how do we have this continued conversation? I know that the 6 of us, the 7 of us will continue, and those who are listening will continue to encourage and inform and try to equip our base. But we're talking about a mass of people who were dejected big time in 2016, and it was very evident 2 years later, and it took a series of events to really bring people back to the front to recognize that this is the most important election in their lives up to now. It really is, and I'm optimistic, but I'm also concerned because I know fatigue plays a prominent role. I know that there's an element of fear that really sits at the very precipice of our psyche, and if it goes in the wrong direction, I'm troubled by that. I'm concerned by that because we've poured a lot of energy into trying to get those or convince those the importance of exercising their constitutional right. That I think that this is the change that was meant to be, and that we can move forward from this. How do we have that conversation?
I think it's a really tough question and really important question, because for me, what you actually are bringing up, and I'll say that actually I'm not sure it matters who wins the vote, who wins Tuesday, because as Pastor Matthews said, there might be individuals, let's say political leaders, who use race and racism as a catalyst, right? Or they use it as an accelerant to their mission. But those individuals are also a symptom of the 43 and 44% of people in our country who are thinking and acting and doing a certain way, right? And that symptom is really problematic, and it is built out of fear, and it is built out of that sense of what law. I loved, Pastor Matthews, what you were saying about Reconstruction. I hadn't really made that personally, had not made that connection before. But what is the sense of loss that they're about to experience? You know, and why that loss is creating sadness, anger, and fear, and whatnot. And that's going to exist regardless of who wins the election on Tuesday night, right? Or 60 days hence, right? Who knows when that's going to happen? And so I think, so part of it, and this is something that I would say that in Jewish tradition is really important. You know, in Jewish tradition, you know, we say two Jews, three opinions. And that's actually an ethic, that's you know, not just a joke. But there is an ethic of recognizing that there needs to be, we do need to be sitting down and actually talking to each other and trying to understand each other from other points of view. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that there is an equal perspective. There still needs to be a majority perspective, right? And that's okay. And over time, you know, that majority will need to be able to solidify. I am also optimistic. I think that what we are seeing is in some ways the last gasp of the last gasp of a white supremacy that is losing its grip on power. But in that loss, they're going to do things that are going to be quite painful. And we as a community need to be prepared also across lines of difference to stand up and to say, yes, but this is what the majority has decided, right? And this is what our future is going to be. And we do not accept violence, and we do not accept, you know, various different things. And we're going to chart a path forward that also hears your fears and hopefully, you know, brings enough people along to ultimately, you know, make a larger change towards the future. So I'll stop speaking, but I really appreciate what your question and what we're talking about.
You know, one of the things that we've had an ongoing conversation, especially over the last 2 weeks in my congregation, is that no matter who wins, and this is kind of piggybacking on what Asher said, no matter who wins on Tuesday or whenever, there's going to be a backlash because we are so divided. And that was one of the words that came up in our opening statements, that we are divided. And we're seeing a new form of division here in our country and in the state of North Carolina and in Charlotte specifically. It seems like there's almost an unwillingness to come and have these discussions that we're talking about tonight, because I believe X, Y, and Z, and you believe A, B, and C, and that's where it stands. So our question as clergy leaders becomes, what is the faith-based response, and how do we lead our people forward, not just in our congregations, but in our communities? Because we are polarized in Charlotte, very much so. And you don't want to drive 30 minutes to go have a conversation. Well, thank God for COVID. We don't have to.
Yep. Well, I think one thing that I would say is that that faith institutions in their very nature are ones that actually live the ethic that a disagreement is the beginning of a conversation and not its end. Right? And it is within faith, and you know, we there's politics within faith institutions all the time. We're always involved with the polity of the synagogue or the church, right? And actually, our very existence and the ways in which we operate can actually be a model for sitting down and listening to one another and trying to recognize the multivocal communities with which we exist, and try to recognize that disagreement exists, that the person who voted for someone different is not mean they're automatically evil, right? But we may have serious disagreements, and we have to understand what those disagreements are. That said, and I will say this because I am in agreement with it, it is really, really hard to understand how people are comfortable condoning racism with the vote. And even for me as a clergy person, I struggle with it. But I do think the faith institutions can play a part. I'm interested to hear what others have to say.
I think I'm sorry if I think just to say that again, going back to history, I think that in our conversation about how we handle this issue of racism, it cannot be detached from a real conversation about economics and the fear of having and the fear of not having enough. So you go back to history and you would look at the roots of anti-Semitism in America had to do with this fear that somehow persons who were Jewish had somehow become wealthy on the backs of white folk, right? When you look at how the Irish immigrants were initially perceived, they were a threat. And how the tension between the Irish immigrant and the free Black community was there. I think it's a matter of economics. And so I'm a preacher, social worker, not an economist, but I do think there needs to be a real thorough analysis, perhaps to ask a question about, is there something embedded in a system of capitalism that pits people against each other and makes us, run around like squirrels trying to get what we need or hoard what we have, that lends itself to a racism that is rooted in. I was thinking about this yesterday. My mom worked for RCA Victor in West Palm Beach. She worked there from 1964 until it closed in 1974. My mom is 80 years old now, and she talks about how when they closed in 74, she just, as a black woman will find a way to take care of her children. She just got up, found another job, worked crazy hours, third shift, all of that, made sure we had what we needed, God bless her. But she would run into, this is a true story, white men who she worked with at RCA, and it would be the mid-90s, early 2000s, and they would talk about, with sadness, I never had a job as good as we had at RCA. And that was 20, 30 years later. There's a real economic fear that I think white America, especially rural white America, especially lower educated white America, they really fear that somehow progress is leaving them behind. And in some ways, it might well be, and we need to understand that.
I was thinking about the fact that 5 or 6 men have more wealth than the entire lower segment of the American population. 6 men. Bezos, it's just six men. So what becomes important to do in moments like this is to breathe, step back, and take a look at what's really happening versus the narrative that's being put before us. The narratives that get put out are definitely put out based on economics and power, right? And someone said something to me once in reference to Charlotte when I first arrived. And they said, Tonyia, if you really want to understand how to make things work and how things work in Charlotte, he said, if it's good for business, it's good for Charlotte. Charlotte did not go and push all of those pro-LGBTQ rights, y'all, because people weren't homophobic. They did that because you can't recruit folk. to a city that is not going to stand strong in support of LGBTQ people. You're just not going to do it. They didn't necessarily talk positively about race because it was the right thing to do. They were very smart. It's a banking town. It's the reason that we could be considered a town with such contrast. How could we be a town that welcomes everybody? Oh, Charlotte's a wonderful town. And then we're like 49th or 50th in terms of trust for one another across race. There's a reason for that. So this is why this idea of the reimagining becomes important, but to do it in the same way that we exegete a text, we have to exegete this moment. We have to really sit down and take a look, like all of my colleagues here on this call have said tonight, what really is happening? And if we can understand that the white person really needs to understand that you're in that same pot with the black person, the only difference is somebody's had you believe you're slightly better just because you ain't black, but we all in the pot. So unless we're able to really have those kind of conversations, to really understand, analyze what's really going on, and some of that, to the both and of this, I think that as a black person, many of us have to be much more unapologetic about dealing with black stuff, period, by ourselves. Black folk grappling with, doing our own analysis, finding out what those things are that are best for us. And then if there are others, similar to the rebuilding of the temple, right? There's a time when we can invite others in. And so this may sound this may be uncomfortable for some people to hear. I wouldn't have said this 2 years ago. I'm gonna say it now, because what I know now is my people are dying. Now, my people are being killed by cops. Now, the children that are black are falling even further behind. That's my situation. John, to your point, right? That's the seat that I hold, and I'm extremely unapologetic about that position. It's one of the things I've always loved about the Jewish faith, to be quite honest. When you really hear, like Rabbi Schindler had said to me one time, she said, we're generous people, we are, but we bless from our overflow and not from our lack. And there was something about that conversation about the way that the family, the unit of the family, like the way that we say, well, how many people are in your congregation? We say individual bodies, right? But the count is different in the Jewish faith. They're counting families, right? Imagine that model of thinking is something that I have always honored and celebrated, and I have gleaned from for my own people. So if we want to talk about racism, as a black person, I need to have those conversations with my own people, with my children, with my congregates, with colleagues. And then as I'm talking to my white or non-black colleagues about these things, I can talk in ways that hopefully will help, John, to your point of going back to talk to other white people, right? Because then that's his uniquely to do. That thing about the assignment in reference to the book of Ezra, right? What is mine uniquely to do? And to be okay leaning into what is mine to do and trusting that, like the children of Israel, everything they needed along the way was also offered. It was there, but they had to just start that walk, right? And I'm definitely not trying we have a wonderful rabbi here who can do much better justice with this, but there was an unapologetic component of it in reference to making sure that the family was okay. And I think we have to get back to some of that as black folk. Take care of family.
I would love to add to what you just said about Charlotte wants to do what is economically best. Charlotte is a pretty city, is what I call it. We want to make sure things are pretty. We tear old stuff down and build up new stuff because it's pretty. In cases where we have angst in the streets, where we've called in the National Guard to deal with a situation, we just need you to be quiet so we can get back to our pretty and move forward. Charlotte is a city of sweeping things under the carpet. But I think we've come to a crossroad and we're at an opportunity to lift up the edge of the carpet and pull some things from beneath. So as you work in your own communities, we were asked, are vigils enough? I know that there are a lot more things going on than vigils. That is 1/16 of the work that is being done. But how do you deal with a city that is absolutely run? You talk about 6 people with all the wealth. Charlotte might be run by 6 people. How do you deal with that as a faith leader? John?
Unabashedly.
Yeah.
My sense is that power is still very, very concentrated in Charlotte, and it is far less concentrated than it used to be. And that's the good news. It doesn't feel that way, and we can ask ourselves whether or not that makes a difference. There are certain institutions, if not people, if not white men, who have an enormous amount of power. And so it may not be the group, that the CEOs of Duke and First Union and Nations Bank and, back when it was not that long ago, but it's those institutions have enormous power because their CEOs often is not live somewhere else. So, we're different in that sense, but the power is still enormously concentrated. And as I think we've all experienced in our efforts to rally together, there is an enormous amount of grassroots energy in the city, and that's good, but it's diffuse. And so we have all worked on initiatives where we've tried to bring the activists and advocates together, and we banged our head against the wall because it doesn't maybe always click or become an homogenous group singing the same verse, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just kind of where we are. So again, both and. I see a lot more grassroots activity in Charlotte than I saw 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's got great energy. Its tendrils reach out in lots of ways. Organizationally, institutionally, I'm an old school guy, and so I'd love to see it come into some harmony a little bit more than sometimes it does. But I'm not going to worry too much about that because I know they're addressing each activist in each organization is addressing the issue as it sees it, and that is legitimate and that has authority. But we need not pretend that just because 6 white men don't gather down around the table at Lance, and that literally is how it used to happen, and call the shots. It's still a highly concentrated city, and we have to keep working to get it away from that and give rising generations a voice. And I think there are signs that is happening. However, it is a long journey ahead.
If I can just add to that and just say that I think also, Bishop Rawls, you are, again, spot on, which is not unusual, about your understanding that Black folk need to just come together and begin to talk about Black issues. I think that is absolutely correct. And I also think there needs to be a conversation where we begin to appreciate the diversity within our own African-American community, that we are not a monolithic kind of people, that we have differences of opinion. We have differences when it comes to all kinds of things, We need to wrestle with the fact that, and I'm not making a political statement, that on Tuesday, the Republican candidate for president will get a higher percentage of the African-American vote than Mitt Romney did, than John McCain did, and we need to wrestle with that. I say that because the solutions that we need to talk about, the economic solutions that will definitely help when it comes to racism, there isn't one answer. And And let me just go out on a limb and say that the term progressive is great. It's a great term, but there are many of us in our community that may not fit that progressive label, that we may have a different understanding of how we uplift our community, how we uplift our country. And there needs to be room at the table for that kind of conversation.
I also think it only takes 3% of people actually standing up for a sustained period of time to actually make a difference. So while Reverend Cleghorn talked about unabashedly and having those relationships and talking with people who are in power, it is also about building power bases of people and of money and support to actually make the change. And what's interesting is that, at least from what I've understood, that sometimes the power bases of banks and money and some of the six leaders that we've heard about in lore and or reality often actually did a lot to split apart power bases in Charlotte. And I think that there's a lot to be said about really trying to figure out how we build enough power with people to be able to really also make sustained change within our city.
I've heard each of you, and I'm reminded that we are to be a light. We sit up on that hill. We are to be a light. We are strong and powerful voices that can influence those within the circle in which we operate in. That's that beginning base that Bishop and many of us have been talking about. But I also have been saying to, especially within my community of people, that systemic racism is something that we will never break. We will never break it. It's embedded in the fabric of this entire system. But I do know that since Reconstruction, we have chipped away at it. And I've been saying to people in my circle constantly, let us figure out how to operate within the system. How do we navigate? Because we've made advancements ever since Reconstruction. We've been moving forward, not as rapidly as many, but we've made progress. We've achieved the highest platitude in this country, according to the way the country is based on, the presidency of the United States. So we know that we have chipped away at the system and that we have made progress. And so I've been speaking to my base constantly as to how do we navigate in this system. And these are the platform bases that all of you are talking about in our circles as to how we begin to not only educate, inspire, guide, lead, help, provide hope, and a promise for a better tomorrow.
Educate and inspire. By the sheer nature of what we do for a living, we are people of hope. And I think one of the major calls to our lives is to incite hope in others. And one way in which we do that is to say where we are hopeful. And I would ask each of you, as our final question tonight, to share with our audience tonight a bit on what gives you hope today. Bishop, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I have hope in us. I believe in us. Fundamentally, I believe in us. I believe in us as people of faith. I believe in us as the children of God. I believe that the Spirit of God really is alive and well in the world. And that for my I place, my job is to just kind of get out the way, get out of God's way and allow God to take this work as we work, as partner with God, to do these things that make the world a better place. But I'm encouraged by us. And that's a big U, us, in that context. Me saying that I'm focusing on working with Black folk does not mean that that is to the exclusion of concern and consideration for all my other siblings. But I can tell you now, and I'm sure, John, Cliff, we've been doing this a long time. And so at 63, my conversation looks a little different than 15 and 20 years ago, Amantha, when we were all talking, the two of us were talking, and you got a little longer in the tooth since we've last known you as well, right? And so, all joking aside, you have to really be sensitive also of self-care in this work. And I want to add that in with the hope that we care for ourselves as we're caring for our people. Thank you. But I feel filled with hope tonight.
Thank you. John Cleghorn, where is your hope today?
Well, I'd echo what was just said. Leave it to a bunch of preachers to start to use metaphors. And so we've heard the bishop talk about building the temple so well. We've had Debra talk about us as light. What comes to my mind is, and this was my response, Amantha, to you about where is organized religion and what should we be doing. And it's a response to you, Debra, relative to what if on Tuesday, how do we speak to each other on Wednesday? We know, and this is the hope, we know America is becoming something new. We know Charlotte is already a majority-minority city. 30 or 40 cities in America are already majority-minority. We know America is going to be minority-majority 2035, 2040. That is the arc, and it is unstoppable. And so that is why we're seeing some ugly, terrifying pushback against that. But the metaphor that I would use is that we are midwives. These are birth pangs. These are birth pangs of America becoming more inclusive, becoming something very different from its worst versions of itself over these last 400 years. And we get to be midwives. We as pastors and rabbis get to be midwives to try to birth this new thing. Now it's strange because we may not hold it in our hands in our lifetime, but we are bringing the process along. And like Bishop, like all of you all, it gives me great life to be able to do it alongside all of you, because it's in the streets and in the meetings that I get to see you all, and that gives me a lot of energy. So God blessings on everybody.
Reverend Cliff, where's your hope this evening?
Well, I want to quote a poem, and I'm going to be quiet after that. I told someone just a few weeks ago that when my smallest children, Moses is age 4, when he becomes a man about 35 or 40, I do not know if there will be something called the United States. I wonder if what we will have would be more of a confederacy of North America, where people just could not deal with the fact that other people now at Bishop's Word has agencies. And so they flocked to Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Idaho, and they took there and started something. And then we're living in an apocalyptic era, in an apocalyptic moment where everything is changing. And so I just want to say where my hope is. I'm going to quote this poem, y'all all know it, by James Russell, and it says, careless seems the great adventure, history pages but record, one death grapple in the darkness, 'tis old systems in the world, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet the scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. That's my hope, that God is still God, and somehow the purpose of God will come to pass.
Amen. Reverend Debra, where's your hope this evening?
It's always wrapped up in Scripture. God has reminded us constantly, Scripture reminds us constantly that I will never leave you nor forsake you. And it rests in that promise, in that hope that no matter what I may see today or tomorrow, there is a tomorrow that promises to be fulfilled. And I'm seeing it in the energy on the city streets today, in the various cities around the country. New energy, a new perspective on how to address this subject of racism and what it's going to take to move from the old faction to a new, which is still cloudy in the minds of many. But I see a hope in a togetherness, and whether many of them realize it or not, they are moving into this promise that the Scriptures speak about, and it is my hope that gives me encouragement. It continues to provide the strength and the desire to want to continue to be out there to help to make a difference in the lives of those that may come in my pathway.
Rabbi Asher, where is your hope this evening?
So today, as I was driving home, I saw a construction site at home from work, and I saw a construction site that said, "Pardon our progress." And I always love the signs on construction sites that say "Pardon our progress," because I think they sort of proclaim an advancement and apologize for the mess at the same time. And they sort of belong in all of the rooms of our houses and every moment of our lives. Dear God, I'm on a journey of faith. Thank you for your trust in me, and please pardon the mess. And I really think that, as my friend Rabbi Michael Marmer taught me, that there's a real distinguishment between optimism and hope, right? To be optimistic means to believe that everything is heading towards a happy ending. To have hope means to believe that whatever happens, a way of coping and building towards the future can be found. So while optimism is a matter of, personality or disposition, hope really is a matter of faith. And I think that we're blessed all the time to meet hope along the way. Not just in joyous moments like the hope that it takes to bring a child into the world, for example, but the hope that we can have to believe that the world can be hospitable to the most vulnerable life, that the hope that we can have a better place, a hope that we can bring our gifts to this world. Hope, really perches on the sense of possibility in our lives, in our home, and that's where I tend to gain hope right now.
Well, Rabbi, you just made all of the Black folk in the Black church stand up and shout. Just FYI. That was amazing. And you all are amazing. Thank you, John and Tonyia and Cliff and Debra and Asher. You all are my hope.
Thank you.
I miss you. I do.
We miss you.
I miss you so much, but I am inspired and delighted and honored to be here with you tonight. Thank you on behalf of Charlotte Pride for being with us tonight. And please, those of us who have joined us tonight, don't just listen to these fabulous faith leaders. Honor their work by joining them in the fight. We are stronger together. It doesn't matter your race, your religion, your creed. We are stronger together. And this is about equality and, yes, hope for the future. We are here, yes, for ourselves, but for those who will come after us. So please get involved. Call these great people. They are there to listen and to lead. We'd like for you to join us in the fourth and final part of this series, which will occur at the end of November. More details to come. But thank you to all of our panelists tonight and for Charlotte Pride for pulling us together in this way. Have a good evening. Prayers for peace.